This is the Simpit. I'm your host, Shaun, but the real star of today's show is the Sim Steering 2 Force Feedback System by Leo Bodnar. I feel like I'm almost underdressed for this occasion today. It's like we have royalty here in the house. This is perhaps the most sought after wheel in all of sim racing, and for many good reasons. This wheel has set a new standard for direct drive wheels and caused many spin-offs, duplicates, and most importantly, something else for sim racers to strive for. Now let's face it, on the big market, on the world global scale, we sim racers, we treat it very seriously. But for the most part, for many years, even for decades at this point, we've been treated like gamers and had nothing but plastic wheels with limited strength, durability, and even realism to choose from. Luckily, in recent years, really since the introduction of the Logitech G25, we've been taken more seriously and we've had some great selection of wheels to choose from. However, when you look to Formula One teams, when you look at industrial applications or the super high-end simulators, they tend to turn to something else, something that most sim racers aren't even aware of, something that most sim racers can't even afford. In fact, when you look at the Leo Bodnar website and see what this wheel was specifically designed for, it doesn't even list sim racing as a hobby as one of those choices. It talks about race teams, training simulators, military, and trade show usage. The Sim Steering 2 Force Feedback System by Leo Bodnar is a direct drive servo motor turned into a sim racing steering wheel. Its typical applications for a motor of this size would be in the industrial world, running a conveyor belt, used in CNC machines, robotics, or even in printing presses. A direct drive servo motor offers incredible speed, incredible torque, extremely accurate positional sensing, and they're very smooth. Now you will notice with it powered off, there is a step. You can feel it going position to position, but once it's powered up, it acts completely differently, and we'll cover that once we get down to driving. So now let's take a look specifically at the Sim Steering 2 Force Feedback System by Leo Bodnar. It includes the Sim Steering control box, the motor itself, the monster-sized motor cable, a USB cable, the power cord, and an emergency stop. I also received both their high and low mount, a wheel adapter, and a basic steering wheel which they included for me to use in this review, but normally it doesn't come with the wheel, buttons, paddle shifters, or anything like that. That's something that you're going to have to deal with third party, adapt something, DIY, or just deal with the basic steering wheel and the adapter and use a H-pattern shifter, which is just fine for a lot of people. Now let's take a look specifically at the 3 different motor sizes provided by Leo Bodnar, starting with the Model 52, which comes in at 16 Newton meters of torque, which is a lot of strength when compared to most wheels on the market. The 53, which is actually the one we are using here, with 20.5 Newton meters of torque, and then the 54, which is the big boy and produces 26 Newton meters of torque. And as you would expect, hardware of this level comes at a very steep price, starting out with the 52, which comes in at 2,880 British pounds, or about $3,500 here in the US. For the 53, it jumps up to 3060 GPS, or about 3,700 US. And for the 54, it will set you back 3,240 GPS, or about 3,900-ish here in the United States. Like I said, it's a pretty steep price, but I have to admit, I've never seen hardware quite like this on my sim rig. Now, we are also supplied the wheel adapter, which is going to set you back an additional 72 British pounds, or 88 bucks. And we are also supplied with both of the adjustable motor mounting brackets that each go for 42 GBP or $51 regardless of which one you choose. As I mentioned, the Sim Steering 2 Force Feedback System does not come with a wheel, but you can always do what I've done. You can get the adapter, you can use just about any kind of aftermarket wheel, just bolt it onto it, use an H-pattern shifter, and anything with a bolt pattern of 6 by 70 millimeter outer, or 3 by 50.8 millimeter inner bolt patterns. The other option is to add the GT3 wheel rim, which is incredible, by Leo Bodnar, but it's going to set you back an additional 1149 GBP or 1400 US. Or the GT1 wheel, which is 1849 British pounds or 2250 here in the US. And yes, these are incredibly expensive options, but they're incredible wheels. They're so beautiful. I can't even imagine having one of those on my sim rig as well. Now, all the pricing I gave you is from the Leo Bodnar website. It is subject to change, but they also have another method that you can go, and that is to go to their official distributor, ProSim. They have some formula-style rims made for this wheel system for the same kind of money, but they're actually having a sale on these wheel systems, and that means a huge savings on the wheel system itself. I have no idea how long those prices are going to last. Now let's go ahead and focus our attention on the control box, and you can see it is rather large. In fact, it's actually bigger than the motor itself. It measures in at 12 inches or 300 millimeters wide, 8 inches or 200 millimeters front to back, not including the connectors, and 6 inches or 150 millimeters tall. And it's pretty simple. Basically, you have where you plug in your power cord, you got the big giant monster cables that go to the motor itself, you've got the USB plug-in, and then you've got the emergency stop button as well. You've got a little green LED light. It lets you know that the power's on, and it is all made of metal, it's all black, and it is pretty heavy duty, coming in at about 9 pounds. Now, when we look at the motor itself, it looks gigantic, but when you really think about it, it's smaller than most motors that you can buy. It's just that this is all motor. No black plastic casing, no power switches or visible fans, just a giant, super powerful motor. The motor I'm testing, the 53, is about 8 inches or 190 millimeters front to back, not including the shaft or connectors. And it's about 4.5 inches or 110 millimeters both wide and tall. And I did mention it's a beast of a motor. This thing, it's 16.5 pounds just for the motor, 7.5 kilograms. The shaft itself, it extends about 2 inches out of the front. It's a 1-inch diameter shaft. This thing is huge, huge shaft on this thing. The entire casing is made of aluminum. It's all black anodized, very nice looking, and it holds a very, very large bearing in the front, which you can tell is made for some heavy duty load. Now, the only thing not mounted completely within the body are these monster size cable pickup points, which I'll turn around so you can see. And there are 2 of them. They both go over to the control box. And these things do stick up quite a bit, about 1.5 inches tall and about 2 inches off that 90-degree turn. Now, they are facing this way, away from where I would have the wheel right now, but you can turn these. They're heavy duty and hard to turn, but you can spin them around any direction. I have them just facing back. That worked well for my rig. You can see a little arrow showing you which way the plugs go on, and you have the same thing over here on the control box showing you which way the plugs go there as well. And those monster cables that go between the motor and the control box, they're some of the biggest I've ever seen, and that's not a surprise when you consider what kind of motor they're actually controlling. Now, those cables are about 2 meters or about 6 feet long, and that allows you to get the control box well away from your rig. The power cord is typical of any you have ever used for a computer case or other kind of power supply, and is available in both Euro and US plugs. The USB cable is very normal, comes in at 3 meters or about 9 feet long. Again, plenty of distance to get it routed over to your computer. And lastly comes the emergency stop, which I have to admit, I haven't been using the emergency stop. I actually do have it here. It's actually pretty simple. Plugs in there, like I mentioned. It's keyed like the other plugs. You basically just hit that, and it's going to take the power out of the wheel. If you have children, you have people who aren't familiar with sim racing, I would highly recommend keeping this handy. For myself, I wasn't that worried about it because I was going to work from low force feedback settings and work my way up. To get this to go ahead and give the power back to the wheel, you just spin it, it pops up again. Slap it off, spin it on. Now, once again, being entirely honest, when I got this and I pulled it out of the box, ow. Oh, look at that. Oh, that is a beast. I mean, That has got to be 15 pounds, maybe 17. Wow. All right, there it is. That is the motor. That is a beast of a motor. And I felt the hulky weight of this. I thought, this is going to be tough to install. But the bottom line is, it was a pretty good, pretty simple installation. It was all covered in their instruction manual, which is very thorough. And I basically just needed to put the brackets on the side and choose between the high and low kit. The bracket kit comes with 2 pieces that bolt directly to the 4 big holes at the front of the motor. Then there are 2 side brackets that mount to those pieces now on the motor. This allows for the bottom to pivot, changing the wheel angle on the wheel deck. The short mount holds the wheel with the shaft being about 2 inches above the wheel deck. The taller mount holds the wheel with the shaft about 4 inches above the wheel deck and has more of a reclined angle to it. From there, you just need 4 holes drilled in your wheel deck, and the dimensions of these holes, or the overall footprint of the wheel with mounts, end up being 6 inches wide and about 2.5 inches front to back. Not a bad footprint at all for a wheel of this magnitude, but again, you're still going to have to deal with that 16.5 pounds and all that torque. Now, the wheel clamp is also very easy to install, also covered in the instruction manual, and it's basically 2 aluminum plates that slide together to create tension, and that's done through these 6 Allen bolts. So you can put that on, but don't tighten it all the way down because you do want to make sure it's relatively centered on the wheel. And at this point, you can just add any aftermarket wheel, any quick release mechanism, or any of those super cool GT style rims that we saw available for this wheel. You could even do a steering shaft directly to this with the clamp and extend the wheel out somewhere else. Now, setting up the software was also very easy. Go to the Leo Bodnar site, download the software, and install it. If you haven't already, go ahead and plug in the USB from your control box into your computer, fire up the Sim Steering software, and you will see your wheel settings. First things first, it's best to find the actual center of the wheel. You don't have to be exact, but you want to tighten down the wheel clamp with it as close to centered as possible using the current position in the upper right to determine where the wheel is. It is okay for it to be off a couple of degrees here, but when it's close, clamp down the wheel adapter. Then you can click the center calibration button on the left-hand side. Now the wheel is ready to go with the default settings. With that, map things into your favorite game and you can get down to driving. Now there are a handful of controls on the right-hand side of that menu that you can use to dial things in for any particular sim or for your own desires. First things first, you have rotation. Anything up to 1500 degrees of rotation with this wheel. You also have center offset and overall damping that can be used to prevent oscillations in certain games. This is followed by all effects scale, which is the overall strength of the force feedback, and I definitely recommend start off low. This is a very, very strong steering wheel. You also have in-game damping, where the game actually controls how much damping, and they recommend setting this to 100. And then you have inertia and friction. Inertia is the momentum in the wheel once you start turning it, and friction is the amount of binding on that wheel preload before force feedback is even coming to it from the game itself. And again, all of these settings are there for you to be able to dial it in for your specific needs, whether it be car to car or sim to sim. When judging a steering wheel and putting cosmetics and pricing aside, it really comes down to how does it handle, how does it feel on the track. When testing a wheel of this magnitude, I wanted to turn in tons and tons of laps in a lot of different sims. Honestly, some of that was for selfish reasons, just being able to drive on this wheel. But on the other hand, I also want to really be able to feel what it was like. Sure, any wheel is going to give you the major hits. Wheel after wheel, the force feedback commands are there, you're going to feel it. But what about those subtle effects? What about the gentle nuances of each sim that really can come to life with the right wheel and the right settings? Starting things off with iRacing, a sim that I drive daily, race weekly, and I have a really good understanding of its force feedback on various different wheels. With this wheel, I started out at about 12% force feedback, which I thought would be minimal, but really quickly I realized that was a bit too much for me for general road racing. I then turned it down to about 9% and really got underway testing the wheel. This was still a very strong wheel, but more drivable for me, and I started turning laps in the Mazda MX-5. A great handling, low-speed car, and fittingly, I drove it at Mazda Raceway Laguna Seca. Honestly, a combination I had tons and tons of laps on other wheels. I was instantly aware of the power of this wheel, but once driving it, it was the smoothness that was the next most obvious feeling. There was absolutely no dead zone whatsoever, and from the moment you turn the wheel, you feel resistance. But it had nothing to do with friction, binding, gear cogging, motor steps, or anything else other than the force feedback being delivered from the game. It was strong and delivered through every degree of steering with no drop-off feeling at all. In the initial laps of driving, it is still the biggest effects that we feel first. The next big thing was the rumble strips. Oh my God, you feel the rumble strips and exactly what type they are. Were they smooth? Were they a big bump type and you're gonna feel it in the wheel? Or were they the rib type? Are you gonna get that buh-buh-buh-buh-buh-buh? Regardless of how much force feedback was being delivered in the corner, the Bodnar wheel always had more to give you to let you know what the road was doing as well. As I continued on and got more comfortable with the wheel, which honestly was very natural. It was about as hard as a duck learning to swim on a lake. But that's when I started to feel those subtle effects of the Sim Steering 2 force feedback system. So let's talk that moment, that first moment when you start to turn the wheel. It is as if I can feel the wheels turning on the ground. There's a friction for this that will change with speed. And when the car is rolling with enough force going into the corners, you will then feel the wheels starting to flex, the friction of the ground. And if you continue to turn, the moment that the wheels are exceeding their turning ability and starting to slide, you feel all of these different layered effects in the wheel. Turning into the corners with the Sim Steering 2 force feedback system, you really have to turn with intention. You have to fight and force it. You are fighting the wheels of the car. You're fighting the track surface. And it actually helped me cure some of that erratic driving style that I have when using less powerful wheels where I'll kind of flick it into the corners. With this wheel, you're always being smooth and it really helps you know just how much to turn the wheel. It was when I switched over to the oval side that I got an entirely new sensation from the wheel. It was at Charlotte in the trucks and I was feeling every bump and drop off in the track. These weren't wheel oscillations, but there were the wheels of the truck interacting with the track and therefore being felt in the wheel. With the smooth and powerful force feedback of the Sim Steering 2 wheel, you could also really feel what the rear end of the truck was doing. Despite being mid-corner and having the delivery of forces from turning being put on the wheel, it still had the power to deliver those bumps combined into those effects. And when the truck started to slide, you immediately felt the wheel go lighter. And from there I moved on to turning laps in Assetto Corsa, Project Cars, R-Factor 2, and F1 2016. And in each of these sims, the Leo Bodnar Sim Steering 2 force feedback wheel system really enhanced the game. It made that link between your hands and the wheels and what the sim was doing that much more noticeable. In Assetto Corsa, things were as natural as they could be. AC has such great force feedback when it comes to that real feeling of being in the car. Without changing the power of the wheel, you could almost tell the era of the car you were driving by the weight in the wheel itself. Drive an older car from the 60s or 70s or 80s and you will feel a strong, hard-to-turn wheel. You will get tremendous friction of the road, the wheels, the bumps, and anything else that is going on with the car. In the more modern cars, the wheel is lighter to the touch, but still delivers great feedback for the driver to work with. Each car came to life with its own feeling of force feedback being delivered from the wheel. Now with Project Cars, it actually did take a little bit more time to get everything dialed in. But once I got the settings all set up, got it to where it really started to mesh the game and the wheel, it really, again, took things to a whole new level. Again, the power of this wheel, the smoothness of this wheel, and the lack of any flex whatsoever in the wheel, and this really enhanced the game. You feel the tires, you feel the G-forces, you feel the car fighting to get grip in the corners. And in Project Cars, you really feel the effects of hitting other cars or being hit. You will instantly know through the wheel. The only downside of Sim Steering 2 wheel in Project Cars was that when you were waiting to go on track, the wheel will bounce and sit there oscillating back and forth about 15 degrees in each direction. I can grab the wheel and hold it still and get it to settle down, or I could always hit the emergency plunger if I had to. But I did set the overall damping in the software to 30 and it completely removed that problem altogether. R Factor 2 was also a real pleasure to drive with this wheel, and I know I'm starting to get a little repetitive, so I can save us a little bit of time. But no, just like the other Sims, the smoothness, the strength, the speed, the accuracy, and the subtle through heavy force feedback effects were very noticeable. But in R Factor 2, it was somewhat mod dependent into what each car felt like. Where in other Sims, the force feedback was heavily affected by the type or era of car that you were driving, in R Factor 2, it was just car by car, and I found myself turning to adjusting the software to get the desired effect. But when all things were dialed in, it, like other games, did perform very well. Also had the same oscillation problem that I had with Project Cars, but that was also easily remedied by adding a little bit of that overall damping in the Sim Steering 2 software. Of all the Sims that I tested, it was F1 2016 that actually had the least amount of benefit or gain from driving with this wheel. I never quite got the same feeling or increased feeling from the Sim as I did with others. I was also driving with my sequential shifter, and going through that many gears that quickly made it a rather difficult task. The effects were all there, and the wheel worked flawlessly, but it didn't add to this Sim as much as it did the others. So now that we've talked about the specs of this wheel, installing this wheel, the pricing of the wheel, and most importantly, how it actually handled out on track in our favorite Sims, now it's time to kind of summarize things with the good, the not so good, and the bottom line. So let's start things off today with the good. And the first one is so obvious, if you saw me sweating during the races, you probably got an idea of what I'm talking about. Oh, I am tired from that. And it is the overall strength of this wheel. It is so powerful by comparison to almost every other wheel I've ever touched in my entire lifetime of sim racing. It is a powerful monster, and that is a good thing because you can always dial it down to what you need and you know it's going to last for a lifetime. In fact, it's so strong that you need an emergency stop switch. Next up is how smooth it is. There's no friction, there's no cogging, there's just that slight hint of the stepper motor, which you can barely feel once you're out and driving. It's silent. It makes absolutely no noise at all other than the vibration sound, which really might be my entire rig. No flex. This is the firmest or the stiffest wheel combo I have ever tested. Incredible delivery of force feedback with no loss and no clipping when set within reasonable limits. Next up is just the factor of being able to drive with total confidence, being able to feel every aspect of the game or sim that you're playing. It makes every PC sim better. Really strong, but soft at the moment you hit the bump stops, which are also adjustable. Immersion. A wheel of this power and this realism draws you further into the sim. Degrees of rotation, adjustable up to 1500 degrees. Easy to mount, 4 holes, small footprint. You're just dealing with the size and the power of the wheel. Easy to install, plug and play, easy software to use and configure. Incredibly sexy. Now, some people might argue with me. Maybe it isn't aesthetically the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, but I'll tell you what, everyone is going to notice this on your rig, and that makes it sexy or beautiful to me. Next up, it's bulletproof. There's really nothing that can go wrong. There's nothing that can break. This motor is so overbuilt for the application of what we're using it for. It runs cool to the touch. I had heard rumors of these being hot. It's got a warning. After all of my races, I touched it. It was never anything more than warm. Could put my hand on it right after racing. Next is being so state-of-the-art. This is the big kahuna, the A#1. This is the most sought-after wheel in all of sim racing, and that makes it a little extra special. There's no denying that. Next up, I already mentioned it, but I'm going to come back to it again, and it's confidence. It's that ability to push so hard because of how much you feel the layers of the physics, the layers of the force feedback coming from the sim, through the wheel, allowing you to really adjust the way you drive. I find myself turning in and having to really fight into the corners. I know I've said all of this, but I just can't reiterate enough. Fighting into the corners allows me to be that more precise. However, it does take a toll and it wears you out a little bit. And for those of you out there who are using sim racing as a real training for a real life car that you're driving, this wheel is going to be able to deliver the kind of forces that you're accustomed to regardless of the kind of car that you're used to driving. Now let's move on to the not so good. And I have to admit, I had to really think about things that I thought were detrimental to this wheel, things that might be a factor for anybody who is really considering purchasing one of these. So I had to struggle, and you can be a judge for yourself as to whether these factors affect you or whether I'm even right about them. So let's start off with, you're going to need a serious, strong sim rig to handle this beast. Now, is that a flaw of the wheel? I mean, that is why you bought the wheel. So having a rig that can go hand in hand is going to be important. I'm using an R-Seat N1 chassis. It works great. There's a little bit of vibration through the entire rig. You'll notice I have to turn my mouse upside down because it'll move around and bring up the arrow when I'm driving. So, again, buying this wheel, it's a serious wheel. You're going to need a serious rig. Is that really a flaw of the wheel? Next up is, well, it doesn't come with a wheel, it doesn't come with buttons, and it doesn't come with shifters. Now, there are options, but there is expensive in options as the wheel itself practically, and I mean not literally dollar to dollar, but they're very expensive options, driving the price of this even higher up. But again, very serious thing. The people who are probably in the market for this, that kind of pricing for the wheel itself is just another small price to pay, and look at how much cooler it would be with one of those F1 wheels instead of just a generic wheel onto it. Another one, not a big deal, but I'm going to mention it. Usually you get a wheel, that's all you have to deal with. In the case of this is the power supply. It is big. Again, you've got 6 feet you can get it away from your rig, so you're not stuck with it right there, but this is a big box that you're going to have to hide. If you're looking for a really, really well put away area, everything super clean, this is something else you're going to have to deal with. Next up is probably the first factor that I really think is legitimate, and that is I spent a little more time working with the software. Now, it's easy to use, but because of the power of this wheel, how much it'll wear you out, I did find myself making more adjustments on sim to sim or car to car just to get things perfectly right. Again, it wasn't difficult. Just move some sliders around, retest it. Once you get it dialed in, you get it just to where you're totally happy with everything going on. And the next one, I don't even know if you could put it on the shoulders of Leo Bodnar, but the bottom line is, when it comes to overall force feedback, it's only as good as the sim that you're actually driving. I mean, basically, if you don't have the best force feedback commands, no wheel on the planet is going to correct that, but this one's still going to do a more forceful, faster, smoother version of that, regardless of what sim you are driving. And then the final one, and I'm sure if you've been following through this review, you've been thinking it from the beginning, it's rather obvious, and it comes down to it being expensive. I mean, it's very expensive, even without a fancy wheel on top of it. It gets even more expensive at that point. It really hasn't compared to any other wheel I've really tested as far as price goes. But, I mean, you've heard it already from me. You know my feelings on this wheel. I mean, forget having kids, buy this wheel. Forget going to college, buy this wheel. Forget buying a new car, buy this wheel. What can I say? What can I say about it? So let's move on to the bottom line. If you've been watching the show for a while, I've actually been driving on a single monitor. I even was using a Logitech wheel, which is like the polar opposite to this on the spectrum of wheels nowadays. But I was doing rather well with that combination. I mean, you don't have to have the best tools on earth. Look at some of the champions out there. They've done it on Logitech, Thrustmaster, Fanatic wheels. It's very common for people to be able to do it on anything. A single monitor, a simple computer. You don't need elaborate systems. However, this is our hobby. This is where we spend so much of our free time. And then you have to look at things. There are people who build very elaborate rigs. I think about Remco Hitman and that incredible simulator. I call it a simulator because it was such a simulation of a car and what we do in simulation. And people take it very seriously. Now, I came into this review wanting to tell you that you didn't have to have one, or that it wasn't that big of a deal, but it's not that easy to make that argument, to be honest with you. I mean, I now know what all the crazy hoopla was. I now know why this is the kind of wheel that Formula One teams use when building a simulator or getting a simulator for their teams and their drivers to really use. And they have the money for it. But more importantly, there's a reason that they go to a wheel like this. The realism, the way it delivers the force feedback is the kind of power that they can use to duplicate the kind of car that they're reproducing. That means when they're training, they can duplicate the forces that the drivers are going to feel on the track and get that realism one-to-one, and that's extremely important to them. Now the big question is, does this wheel do what no other wheel out there can do? And the answer to that is yes and no. I mean, force feedback somewhat is in the hands of the simulations themselves. It is being delivered from the sim to the wheel, and therefore you start off with the sim no matter what. However, with that said, with the exact forces coming from the sim to the wheel, this wheel can do more than others, so to speak. Force feedback comes in layers. You've got subtle effects, you've got major effects, all being combined into the signal being sent to the wheel. Because of the power of this wheel, because of the smoothness of this wheel, it is easier to feel those layers of effects without being overwhelmed by the overall combined effect. In iRacing, that feeling the stages of movement is key and critical to that confidence-building feeling that the Sim Steering 2 gives you. The wheel actually teaches you to work with the car and be a better driver. When all wheels talk to you, tell you what the simulator is doing, but the big question is, are you listening? But the Leo Bodnar Sim Steering 2 force feedback system, it screams at you. It's downright impossible not to hear what it has to say and always know what's going on in the sim. In my testing, I was using the wheel, no paddle shifters, no buttons, and a sequential shifter. To me, this is a huge disadvantage when it comes to overall lap times, as I was driving with one hand a good percentage of each lap. But with this wheel, I was setting record lap times in the Miata on a track and setup that I know very well. The wheel and the physics of the game allowed me to push and feel the car that much more. I was aggressively turning in and having to fight the wheel for every degree with intention. I could then feel the moment the car was stepping out and could reduce wheel input, and that allowed me to get on the gas that much earlier with confidence that the wheel would tell me when it was too much gas. This wheel also blew me away with what my new definition of zero flex really is. There is just, I mean, all the flex you see right here seems to even just be in this wheel rim, and this is a pretty stout wheel. A little bit of up and down flex, that's my rig itself flexing. This thing is a beast when it comes to its stiffness. This is the kind of wheel, this is the kind of motor that I can imagine being in a fly-by-wire car like a Corvette, where you're no longer connected to the steering shaft. But this wheel is powerful enough to duplicate the forces of a real car. It can feel like you're turning a steering shaft, feels like you're moving a steering rack, and more importantly, I can feel it moving the tires. So how does one justify a wheel of this cost for our hobby? And the key word here is actually hobby. And if you compare this to other hobbies out there, I don't think the price is all that much by comparison. Let's start off with bicycles, something that I love very much. You can go down to the bike shop, buy a decent bike for $300 to $400. And for that amount of money, you bought a good bike. It'll last you a lot of years. Ride it to the beach every day, keep it in the garage. It's perfect. But if you become a bicyclist, you become immersed in the hobby. Well, spending $4,000 on a bicycle is quite an easy task. I mean, if you become into automotive tuning, just buying the parts for your car, buying a set of wheels, this is chump change by comparison. I could go on and on from hobby to hobby or sport to sport where this is the case. RC cars or planes, golf, skiing, musical equipment, and many, many others. But in nearly all of these cases, the entry point, the starting point could be $300 to $400 and quickly jump up to $1,000 or even tens of thousands of dollars in many cases. So I'll actually best quote or leave it to Ferris Bueller himself.
I love driving it. It is so choice. If you have the means, I highly recommend picking one up.
So to wrap things up, as I had mentioned in this show, I'd love to tell you that you don't need this wheel. Sure, your old wheel is fine, but it's not that easy to make that statement. I mean, your old wheel is fine. Wheels like that have won many a championship, and they're going to go on to win many, many more championships. But at the same time, they can't really compete with a wheel like this on so many levels. The strength, the smoothness, the force feedback delivery, and the longevity. Now, to make you feel better, I accept the fact that this is out of the price range for most sim racers. I totally get it. However, if you do the math, if you think about how many hours you spend on this hobby and you divide that over how much time over 1 or 2 years, it could be pennies on the hour for a wheel like this. And I think, is that really too much money? For me, I really do think, is that too money for the overall amount of enjoyment? I guess it really comes down to how elaborate is the rest of your rig. I mean, again, if you're sitting out there with a normal wheel on a desk with a single monitor, I don't even think you'd be considering this wheel at all. However, if you've already spent thousands of dollars on the rest of your rig, the rest of your setup, is this one step too far? We are talking about the steering wheel itself. So I hope you've enjoyed this review of the Leo Bodnar Sim Steering 2 force feedback wheel system. I hope I've answered every question you might have, told you everything you wanted to know. But if I missed anything, you feel free to email me at shaun@thesimpit.com and I'll answer any questions that you might have out there. I'd like to thank the guys at Leo Bodnar for letting me try out this amazing wheel and bring it to all of you. This is the Simpit. I'm Shaun Cole, and I'll see you on the track.